What's up, everybody? It's the same day as the previous video. I just kind of wanted to give an overview of the car in that video, and now I'm gonna start working on it and kind of doing some things. So like I previously stated, I want to start building another skid plate for my car, and that's gonna be the goal for today if we have enough time. If not, I'll finish it out tomorrow morning. So to kind of give a better understanding of why I'm needing a skid plate, if you look underneath my car, you can see the oil pan right there. Trying to get the lighting a little bit better. But as you can see, it's basically even, if not the lowest point on the car. So if I drive the car on the track or if I drive the car on the street, it kind of becomes an issue of concern. If I end up hitting a pothole, or if something's randomly in the middle of the road, or if the car kind of bottoms out while I'm driving, that the oil pan is going to be the first thing that hits. And if that happens, well, then my engine goes bye-bye. So that's the plan of attack today. I went down to our local Home Depot yesterday, and I bought a sheet of 16 gauge metal. I'm not too sure if it's going to be thick enough or strong enough. I'm pretty sure it will. It's the same material I made my fan shroud out of. My previous skid plate, I used an old street sign that one of my buddies gave to me, and I made that happen. But street signs are really hard to bend, and me and John got really lucky whenever we first made that first one together with us, so that it didn't crack and break. I've tried making ones after that, or like for like my radiator shroud. I've tried making something like that out of the street signs as well, but it just tends to break or crack and fall apart. So we're gonna try out the 16 gauge sheet metal and give it a shot and see how it does. If not, I'll try to go somewhere else and find some thicker material, thicker gauge metal that I can use for a skid plate. And but first though, gotta use some cardboard. I don't wanna cut up the sheet of metal because it's very expensive. I think it's like $63 for a 24 by 24 piece of 16 gauge sheet metal. So I'm gonna take some cardboard here in a second, and I'm gonna kind of draw everything up on it and bend it and cut it into place how I want. And then also use some tape to try to get some angles the way I want to. That way I can go ahead and trace it out on the piece of metal, and then use my bender that I have, which is just like a Harbor Freight bender that I bought really cheaply, and kind of bend it into place, and then see if I can get it to mock up and fit correctly underneath the car, and then hopefully bolt it up, and I'll have my skid plate, and I can go drive the car around today if the weather permits. So I managed to crawl underneath the car. I took a piece of cardboard and kind of took some scissors and a Sharpie down there with me, and I kind of outlined everything and was cutting it out as I was going along. I didn't want to take y'all down there just because I didn't want to get John's camera dirty. But I was able to get a template kind of made up, a rough template. That way I can kind of trace it out on the piece of metal before I cut it. And here, this is what the template looks like. Obviously it's rough, but you kind of get the general idea of it. You kind of get the general idea of it. It's going to be sitting something kind of like that, more or less. And I kind of marked it where I want to put my bins at, or I put the bins in the cardboard. That way I kind of know later on where I want to go. And then I'll just slowly kind of work little by little as I end up working on this piece of metal, as I trace it out and then go back through and cut it out and trim it, and then as well as kind of fixing up the edges. That way everything is nice and smooth. It's not going to sit there and cut me whenever I go underneath the car, because that wouldn't be great. But kind of on a time limit, John wants to go do something at 5 o'clock today. It's about 1:30 right now, so I got about an hour and a half. So I'm gonna go ahead and try to get this marked up on the piece of metal and get it cut out. And then I can use my bender to try to get some bends in. But if I run out of time, like I said, I'll probably be back out here tomorrow anyway, and I'll just end up working on the piece tomorrow and try to get it all finished up, as well as working on the ride height of the car. And since I recently put in rear spring spacers to try and raise the rear of the car up a little bit, they were only supposed to be 1 inch, but from the looks of it, it raised it about 2 to 3 inches. So I got to kind of figure out what's going on there. I do have like some rubber insulators that come from the factory that go on the springs to kind of keep them from rattling, and it also kind of help keep the springs in place, which isn't too big of a deal with my car since I run TRD short stroke shocks on my car. So I don't have to worry too much about the springs whenever the rear end separates. I don't have to worry about the springs just falling out. Some people talk about it, and that's why a lot of people want to switch over to true coilover in the rear. But if you run correct struts or shocks, whatever you want to call them, in the rear, and if you get short strokes, you're not going to run into that issue. Whenever I originally switched over from coilover to this, the rear end of the car dropped down like 4 inches nearly, and it was sitting really good. And I kind of want to get that fitment back, but I also have to work with it a little bit as well to get the ride height. That way the car isn't so low in the rear and it matches the front a little bit so the car handles better whenever drifting. But that'll be something. It doesn't look like I'm going to get to today, so it'll probably be a continuation of this video tomorrow. But for the time being, I'm going to get the template drawn out on a piece of metal and I'm going to start cutting. So as you can kind of see, I went ahead and I traced out the template on the sheet of metal. I went ahead with the straight line and I fixed up the bottom and stuff like that and some of the edges, which I'm going to round off anyway, but I'd rather have like a straight line instead of it being all over the place, and it gives me kind of a better guideline to follow. And now I'm going to go ahead and get out the angle grinder and start cutting this guy up to shape, and then grind off some of the edges. That way it's nice and smooth. I don't have to worry about anything cutting me, and then I can start looking at getting everything mocked up and bent. So I was able to get the piece cut out, and I went ahead and I grinded away the edges. So hopefully it's not sharp anywhere. If it is, I'll go back and I'll kind of grind it, or I'll hit it with some sandpaper to kind of knock off the edges. I know it looks a little awkward and it's not proportionate. To be honest, I don't know if the car is really proportionate, or it could just be horrible tracing. I'm just gonna put it at horrible tracing, to be honest. But it'll get the job done. So now, God, that really is off. You know, like they say, measure once, cut twice. But it'll do. If I have to go back and change anything, I'll go back and I'll change it. As long as it bolts up and it fits, then I'm not gonna worry too much about it. I just got to go through now, and I got to mark the bends on it, and then I'm gonna go ahead and get it all bent up. And once I know it sits in place properly, and I don't have to cut anything else off of, mostly just if I have to cut anything, if it's hitting any of the suspension arms or anything, or if it's gonna be an issue while I'm driving, if at full lock, if it'll hit it. If not, I'm not worried about it being not even on both sides, not proportional. God damn, I really did horrible on this. I'm looking at all these edges and it's terrible, but it'll work. I actually have the original skid plate that me and John made out of an old street sign, and let me tell you, it did its job, that's for sure. This one somehow turned out a million times better, and it was last minute made for 86 Mod Surrey the first year I took my car there. But it looks a lot better than the one I have now, and or the one that I just made. But it was just made out of aluminum, but you can see all the skid marks on it where it was hitting the ground. But essentially that's kind of what I'm making now, except what I made now is just kind of a worse version looking at it. But as long as it keeps the oil pan protected, I'm not too worried about it, because the end of the day, its job is just to make sure that my oil pan doesn't get hit. So as long as it can take the hits, and as long as it bolts up properly and it doesn't give me any issues and it's not a pain, I mean, to me, that's a job well done, and that's a useful part. So I'm gonna get to it now, and I'm gonna start marking everything up for bending it, and then I'm gonna go ahead and get it all bent up and see if I can get it lined up in place. So here's the skid plate. Oh, like I said, I went ahead and I painted it. I just painted it black. I got the underside of it painted as well. So it's ready to throw on the car. And those spacers I was talking about are these guys right here. So these spacers are gonna go in the back of the skid plate where the mounting holes are in the back. You can see like that hole over there. They're basically just gonna sit like that and the bolts are gonna go through them. And it's just to make sure that the skid plate doesn't, if I hit a bump or anything like that, the skid plate's not gonna like bounce up and just hit my oil pan. But okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and start installing the skid plate, and then I'll show you guys what it looks like once I have it fully put on. And once I finish up the whole skid plate, I'll lower down the front of the car, and then we can start taking a look at the rear suspension and figuring out why the car is sitting a little bit too high. I already have an idea of the reason why it's doing that, and I'm like 99% sure I know why, but I'm gonna take a second look at it and just double check, and then but I'll show you guys whenever I get the rear end dropped down, and I can kind of go over the springs, the spring spacers, and then the rubber insulators as well, and kind of show y'all where I went wrong, as well as what I'm gonna do to fix it. And just I can kind of give you a little bit of a closer look at the rear end of the car, since I'll have it up in the air and it'll be a lot easier to see. Okay, so for a closer look, here's the skid plate mounted up. We got the angles on it and everything like that, so that way it sits properly. I'm trying to see if I can get the camera in here. As you can kind of see, so I gave myself about like a 1/4 inch to like an 1/8 inch gap in between the oil pan. And you can see the little spacers I was talking about right there. Let me see if I can get them in focus. Those guys right there. So it's just so that whenever I hit a bump, my oil pan doesn't get crushed by it. So this now makes my skid plate the lowest part on the car, which will be good because that'll be the first thing that hits, but I will have to keep an eye on it every once in a while now, just to check on seeing how it's doing. See when it needs to be replaced next, or if I need to make any more bends a little bit steeper or a little bit less steep, that way it's not taking so many hits, and just to make sure that the oil pan and the rest of the car is protected as well. So that wraps it up for the skid plate build. I'm gonna go ahead and lower the front of the car and jack up the rear of the car, and then we can start taking a look at the rear suspension and figure out why the ride height is so whack right now. All right, cool. So we lucked out, and I was able to get the springs out without having to take the wheels off, thankfully. So the way these springs are made is, so this bottom part actually has a pad on the rear end, and it's actually notched for this. That way, whenever it goes in, it's supposed to go into a certain spot and it kind of locks in place. And the top of it is flat, and that's because there's actually you can kind of see it right there. There's a cone that it actually slides up onto and it goes into a flat surface. So what spring spacers do is, which this is mine with the insulator, which I know this is the reason why I had issues. So the spring spacer goes on top of it and it just sits on top of that top part. And so these are an inch spring spacer, so it should raise the rear end of the car up an inch, but I was having issues to where it was raising the rear end of the car roughly like 2.5, 3 inches. So I think the reason behind that are these insulators. So originally I just had the insulator on top of it, which it was better on there and it was spread out to where the spring spacer actually fit inside these grooves. I think the issue that I was having though is with this guy being a smaller inner diameter doing that, it wasn't able to fully seat on that cone. So what I'm gonna try doing is I'm gonna go ahead and cut around this guy and try to get out this whole entire inner piece, because I still want to preserve the outer piece of it, that way it can sit on top. And with it being able to sit on top of it, it can kind of help with the noise rattle, and it'll just kind of help it overall and make it a quieter ride for the rear end if there is any kind of jiggling or anything like that. So I'm gonna go ahead and give that a shot and see what it does. If it still doesn't fix the issue, I'm just gonna fully get rid of this. So to show you guys before I go ahead and put this guy back in and start working on the other side. So essentially what I did was I took the rubber insulator and I just cut off the whole center section of it. That way I don't have that center section hitting the cone in there, stopping it from fully seating. So now this guy just sits on here like normal. And even if he does add any space, it's maybe like a 1/4 inch. If I'm still not having the issue, or if I'm still having the issue with the height of the car not being what I want, then I'll just go ahead and lower the car back down and I'll rip off these guys. But I'm pretty sure this is gonna solve my issue. So I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna put this guy back in, and as you can see, like, it can fully seat now on that cone. And I'm gonna go ahead and take out the other side and cut the other side just the same way I did as this, and then we can go ahead and put the shocks back on and lower the car back down and see if that fixes the ride height or not. So before I actually end up cutting the other side as well, I just wanted to show y'all, because I wanted to check this out for my own peace of mind. So currently this guy has the rubber insulator that hasn't been cut, and I know it's a little hard to see in there, but there's not much space for that cone at all, which granted, I already pulled this guy down, and earlier whenever he was fully seated, you could only see about maybe where this line is that goes inside the spring of the cone period. That's about where it stops. So this bottom part of it was about right where that ring is. So I wanted to take a look, and pulling this guy out, I wanted to check the difference between me cutting it like this and the way that I had it in there, which was like this. So the insulator is fully on the inside, which stops it pretty early. So I went ahead and I took them in there, and so right off the bat, that's about where the guy was sitting, and now the spring spacer can fully sit up about another inch, inch and a half. So this should fix my issue relatively easy. As you can see, the spring spacer now fully goes all the way up, compared to it being stopped pretty early with this one that hasn't been cut. So I'm gonna go ahead and cut this one and install everything back in. Then I'll go ahead and I'll put the car back together and lower it down, and I'll show you all what the car looks like now. Thanks.